known for its hospitality, its innovation, and I always like to say it's barley for whatever reason. That always comes up in the history books. Barley was one of the most important products. Just a couple of fun facts. It was also the birthplace of gauze. The word gauze comes from Gaza, and many other things. It was home to birthplace of the famous one of the famous Islamic scholars and in the four schools of Islamic thought, Imam Shafi'i. I usually have other pictures, beautiful pictures of Gaza that I don't have time to go through, but this is one from my hometown, home city, and neighborhood of Rimal in Gaza City in the 1920s. Okay, so we've heard the term Gaza Strip a lot. I get asked a lot, and again, I'm trying to address the kinds of tropes, and stereotypes, and myths, and we hear these terms being thrown around: Gaza Strip, mostly refugees, right of return, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that mean? I'm going to break it down a little bit. Okay, so the Gaza Strip is actually a mid-century, 20th century construct that did not exist prior to 1948. When people said Gaza prior to 1948, what they meant by that was the Gaza district, okay? And that was one of many British mandate districts within historic Palestine that encompassed, as you can see, this much larger area. And even prior to the mandate during the Ottoman era and so on, it was the greater Gaza area. So in fact, historically, when people would say in Arabic, Asqalan, the city of Asqalan or Ashkelon, they meant by that Gaza. So it was considered this much broader area, okay? Now, why this is important is in 1948, in the wake of the creation of the State of Israel, invading Zionist militias drove hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes. And in our case, and for the purposes of today, those who were in this shaded area were driven from their homes and sought refuge in the closest urban center to them, which was Gaza, thinking, of course, that they were seeking temporary safety and they would be allowed back to their homes, which was not to happen. The Gaza Strip was then carved out in 1948, 1949 in the Egyptian-Israeli armistice agreement with the understanding that these were not permanent borders and these Palestinians would be allowed back. That never happened. And that influx tripled Gaza's population overnight. The Gaza Strip was created. And thus, we have a situation where today we constantly hear the modern-day Gaza Strip consists overwhelmingly, 75 to 80% of the population, of refugees who do not consider Gaza their home, but rather are from this broader area that we often hear referred to as the Gaza envelope today, Gaza district historically. So that's just by way of context. These Palestinians in Gaza are under the umbrella, receive services and go to schools and health clinics and so forth administered by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA. Separate topic and discussion. They have a separate mandate over the Palestinian refugees and are the only group, in fact, Palestinian refugees that have their own organization. Palestinian refugee status is inherited, unlike other refugees around the world. Anyways, so that's just giving you a little bit of background. Of course, this is what the Gaza Strip then turned into on the right. This is just an illustration of that event I talked about in 1948, which Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe, otherwise known as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And this is just showing you the flow of where Palestinians ended up fleeing to as they were driven from their homes. Those in the north ended up in Lebanon and Syria. Some ended up in Jordan. Some were internally displaced into the West Bank, what would become the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and then were not allowed back, right, to what would become Israel. Again, this is just an illustration of where these populations of Palestinian refugees exist today. And when we hear about this issue of the right of return of Palestinian refugees, this is what it refers to, is allowing those Palestinians to go back to their ancestral homeland. This was also, by the way, any of you heard of the Great March of Return that happened in Gaza? So that's what it was about. It was a several years long nonviolent weekly protest at the northern border of Gaza with Israel to demand the right of return of Palestinians to their homelands, or bring that issue back to light. Okay, so just kind of talking a little bit more now about the overall themes before I get into Gaza itself. Because it's easy to just kind of talk about Gaza and not understand what this is about, or talk about, as Jake said, the here and now with not understanding what this is about. Gaza is part and parcel of the greater Palestinian struggle for liberation, for freedom and movement. It is not its own entity. We frequently talk about Gaza being a metaphor, or Gaza being a laboratory, or the lens through which one can understand the broader Palestinian struggle. Just kind of the most glaring example of that. And I'm trying to see here where I have something, but I feel like I'm out of order. Anyways, the maxim that sort of defines, informs the way in which Israel rules over, and the policies Israel uses vis-a-vis the Palestinians, is maximum control over the land, with as few Palestinians in the land as possible. This is referred to, also known as the Palestinian demographic threat. And that is in order to retain a religious majority in the land. In the words of sitting Prime Minister, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the state of Israel is a state for the Jewish people and the Jewish people only. Now, this is despite the 20% of the Israeli population that is actually Palestinian, and the 50% of the population in the entirety of the land that is Palestinian. Now, the way that Israel rules over Palestinians is through this oppressive system that is otherwise known as apartheid, as defined by several international human rights organizations, through the systematic oppression that divides Gaza from the West Bank, divides West Bank towns and villages from one another, and divides both of those places from Jerusalem. And it does that, it controls the movement of Palestinians through territory-specific ID cards. I don't have time to get too much into that today, but it's an ID card system that it began distributing in 1967 when it formally occupied Gaza and the West Bank. And that ID card will allow you entry into that territory only, but not into the other territories. And you cannot give it to your spouse. You can add your children, but if there's a very complicated system wherein if they aren't there physically and you don't add them, they lose that right to their own land. So it's not like I can just be absent for a certain amount of time. Like if your driver's license expires, or your American citizenship, and you don't renew it, or you don't give it to your kids, or you forgot to apply, they would suddenly lose their American citizenship, right? So it's the equivalent of that. And then this is especially the case now in East Jerusalem. If you're a Palestinian East Jerusalemite and you come and you study in the US, for example, for 2 or 3 years, and you haven't been able to go back to renew your ID card, that's stripped from you, and you no longer have residency rights in East Jerusalem. You might be able to visit as a foreigner, but you no longer are considered a Palestinian citizen, national resident of East Jerusalem. These same laws do not apply to the Jewish Israeli residents of the city, I should add. And if they discover that you also have American citizenship, if you're an East Jerusalemite who has, they'll also take your ID card from your Palestinian ID. Different sets of rules apply to different areas. You can read more about it. A lot of these graphics are from the site Visualizing Palestine, which I highly recommend you check out, but I'm just gonna move on because we don't have much time. So again, it's kind of this divide and conquer, ghettoizing of Palestinian populations, the largest ghetto being the Gaza Strip. But it's just important to remember that theme of separating Palestinians from one another, maximizing control of the land, and restricting or denying them movement at all in some cases. Oops. Just showing you, we're not spending too much time on the West Bank, but I think it is important to highlight that often we see maps where we see Gaza and the West Bank as like contiguous blobs. But I just wanted to highlight this really quickly. What does anyone notice? Just a quick observation about this map. Okay, a lot of what are known as, and I apologize if what I'm saying is rudimentary, I don't know everyone's knowledge of it, but a lot of what are known as illegal settlements or Israeli settler colonies. What else? Okay, very good. So the green areas, which are known as Area A, Palestinian Area A, are completely separated from one another by hundreds of Israeli checkpoints, some of them flying checkpoints, some of them permanent military checkpoints, barriers, some of them temporary, some of them not.
Share the screen real quick.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, not bad. I thought it was.
In addition to the checkpoints that divide those towns from one another, as you can see, 60% of the area of the occupied West Bank is known as Area C, which is actually under full Israeli civil control. And Palestinians are barred from developing or building in 99% of that land. So taken in conjunction with that Area C, which is now a closed military zone that Israel has effectively annexed, and the separation barrier and the military checkpoints, Palestinians have only, nominal authority over a fraction of the occupied West Bank, which of course is completely separated from Gaza, right? Okay, so now we're gonna go back to Gaza for a second. It's the size of the Baltimore metro area with 2 times the population, just by way of reference. And it is the most closed off and surveilled place on Earth. And I'm going to get into a little bit into that later. It's always been subject to some form of closure by Israel. But as you can see here, every border, land border, all of the airspace and all of the sea space is completely controlled by Israel. So there's even a buffer zone that extends about a mile inland into Gaza, what's called the no-go zone, where about 1/3 of Gaza's arable farmland exists. There's been a naval blockade on it, so fishermen can only go out about 4, at worst, maybe 8 at best, nautical miles into sea. And there was a semi-functional airport at one point that was completely destroyed as well. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Israel controls everything about Gaza, from people who enter and leave to what foods are allowed in or out to when you can turn the electricity on to how much water you get. And to illustrate that, oops, I have this very short little video. Has anyone seen this before? I don't want to play it. I always have to ask. Okay, good. A couple of people. I feel really bad for people who have seen this before, because then they're hearing me repeat myself over and over. So this was actually created in 2011, I want to say, maybe even 10, after Israel's first attack on Gaza, Operation Cast Sled. And it's just amazing to me that how true it still holds. It was created by an Israeli human rights group and Israeli animator. Is it working? So I don't have much time left, so I'll try to whiz through the rest of this. But yeah, well, I want to make sure they have time to. So I talked earlier about how, we often hear of Gaza being under blockade or enduring a siege since X amount of time, since 2006. But the reality is Gaza has been subject to some form of closure, sanctions, or blockade ever since the early 1990s. And I usually give the sort of reference of the visual of sort of a noose getting tighter and tighter around Gaza over the years by different ways of restrictions, whether it was the banning of the family unification permits that were allowed, the disengagement, the closures happening after that, and so on. I talked about always, when you think about Gaza, thinking of it again, thinking about the bigger picture, that this is really not just about Gaza, but it's about a struggle, an overall Palestinian struggle for rights and freedom from an oppressive system and a violent system of Israeli apartheid that ghettoizes Palestinians within the West Bank, Gaza being the largest one of that ghettos, with the overall policy of maximizing Israeli control over the land with as few Palestinians in that land as possible, leaving Palestinians with the false choice of what I like to call the right to remain silent. Israeli Minister Smotrich has put this as termed it the Smotrich plan, which is Palestinians have 3 choices. They either accept a life of subjugation under Israeli rule. They leave, so forced transfer, forced or voluntary transfer, or they get killed, or we kill them. So this is called the Smotrich plan. You can look it up. They're pushing it now and trying to transfer Palestinians in Gaza into the Sinai in line with this plan. Okay, so Israel's relationship to Gaza has been defined through this tone of repression. Again, this is nothing new. It didn't start on October 7th. It didn't even start, in the early 2000s. Shortly after the 1948 war, very shortly after, one Ariel Sharon at the time, before he became the prime minister of Israel, was assigned to a kill unit, an Israeli kill unit called Unit 101. And they were tasked with killing Palestinians who had newly become refugees within Gaza, who were trying to go back to their homes, towns and villages across the border. And he massacred dozens of Palestinians in an infamous massacre in the Brej refugee camp in 1954. Again, in 1956, you have the Suez Crisis, also known as the tripartite aggression. My mother was a survivor of this particular massacre, and I remember growing up with her telling me tales about it. If you want to know more about it, I encourage you to read Joe Sacco's graphic novel, Footnotes in Gaza. It's fantastic. In the early 1970s, once again, Palestinians, Gaza has always been considered kind of like this hotbed of resistance when it comes to Israeli occupation. At that time, interestingly, they were known as the Fidaiyin, Palestinian resistance fighters, who were actually members of the Marxist Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. So remember, Hamas didn't exist at this point, okay? So again, Ariel Sharon, the same characters kind of make this appearances over and over when it comes to Gaza, is assigned to go into Gaza and pacify the Fidaiyin. And so he goes in and he orders the bulldozing of large swaths of tracts of land and homes, thousands of homes within the refugee camps, and the summary execution of over 1,000 Palestinian men, earning him the moniker, the bulldozer.
My grandfather was shot. Yeah.
Oh, really? Subhanallah, I didn't know that. And so in 1987, you might have heard the word intifada. It was really never a big deal. I don't know why suddenly it's the scary word. We grew up with, I grew up in the first, not there, but I mean, visiting regularly during the first Palestinian intifada, also known as the shaking off or the first Palestinian uprising. The birthplace was the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza that you might hear about in the news right now. So unsurprisingly, you often see that the birthplace of a lot of Palestinian resistance happens to be in refugee camps, not just in Gaza, but often primarily in Gaza, but also, for example, in Lebanon. And that is for a reason that I talked about earlier, which is, of course, the displacement and the ethnic cleansing of those Palestinian refugees from their homeland. Gaza was also the location of, it was all over Palestine, the second Intifada, but I'm referring specifically to Rafah, which we might hear about now in the news, bordering Egypt, where Ariel Sharon was prime minister at this time, and ordered the demolition of hundreds of homes in Rafah bordering Egypt, and razed over 2/3 of Palestinian homes in that area. It was during this period that American activist Rachel Corrie was killed trying to protect Palestinian homes in Rafah. So again, just keeping that in mind, that the repression of Gaza specifically, Palestinians more broadly, is nothing new. We've heard a lot about these plans, these open Israeli calls to ethnically cleanse, to displace, to transfer, push Palestinians out of Gaza into Sinai. And this is actually a continuation of I want to call it a fantasy that Israeli leaders had dating back to the early 1970s. I'm talking about Gaza specifically. It was called the Alone Plan. And it was this attempt to what they call thin the population of Gaza, to get rid of as many Palestinians there as possible. Again, in tune with, remember I talked about the demographic threat and reducing the Palestinian population and then annexing Gaza. So that was never totally fulfilled, although many thousands of Palestinians were actually transferred out of Gaza and into Sinai during this period. I met a lot of them after the Israeli disengagement in 2005, who for the first time in decades had been reunited with their families. Israeli leaders have often considered Gaza a thorn in their side. Even former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was one of the, of course, negotiators, leaders during the Oslo Accords, famously said in 1991, he wished he would wake up one day and found that Gaza had sunk into the sea. Okay, so this kind of brings us up to speed to 2005. And I usually start here, but today I added a bunch of other things. Yes?
You define intifada for me?
Intifada? Yeah. Yeah, Sammy, you want to?
Yeah, it just linguistically just means uprising. It's the Arabic word for uprising.
Yeah, it literally means like the root word is like shaking off. But it's sort of more broadly understood like figuratively as uprising. Yeah. Literally means shaking off of like the occupation, figuratively the uprising. Okay, so I usually start in 2005, and this was the year that Israel disengaged. This was the original name was the Israeli separation, actually. And it was this we often hear in the news, Israel left Gaza in 2005. How many people have heard this phrase? By a show of hands. What more do they want, right? We left, we gave them Gaza. So this process was called the disengagement, and it was formulated by Ariel Sharon and his advisor at the time, Dov Weisglass. And it was actually a strategic sort of reformulation of Israel's occupation of Gaza and nothing more. It was a dismantling of the illegal settlements, Israeli settlements within Gaza, and the relocating of those settlers elsewhere to the occupied West Bank, and the reinforcing of the occupation remotely on Gaza. So instead of having settlers and soldiers within Gaza in what they considered to be in harm's way, they started to control Gaza remotely from the outside. They reinforced the wall and the electric fence around Gaza with sniper towers and began to monitor Gaza 24/7 with drones and tighten that noose around Gaza. It was nevertheless in the very brief days after the disengagement, these are pictures I took the day after when I was living in Gaza at the time of reporting, you know, a momentous occasion, because for the first time in decades, these Palestinians on the left had access to this beach, this shore, which was formerly for the exclusive use of the Jewish settlers in the Rosh Katif settlement block. They weren't allowed, Palestinians weren't allowed to use it. On the right, this was a Palestinian photojournalist. I remember seeing him taking pictures of the settlements after they were dismantled and torn down. And he was wearing a vest with images of Palestinian babies and children that had been murdered by Israeli troops. And he said he was doing it as a reminder for anyone just, you know, who was documenting this to remember them and the sacrifices that were made in the years prior. So this was a unilateral process, again, that Israel undertook without any consultation or coordination with their Palestinian authority counterparts at the time, run by Yasser Arafat and the Fatah movement. In the words of the architect of the disengagement, Dov Weisglass, this was to be considered nothing more than a sort of strategic political move that intended to freeze the political process and any prospect for so-called peace with the Palestinians. They wanted to ensure there would never be a Palestinian state. And he, in his own words, said, don't understand it as anything else. We are not handing Gaza back. We are not ending our occupation of Gaza. Now, that is sort of the context that leads us up to the Palestinian elections in 2006. After the disengagement, what happens is an unprecedented closure of the Gaza Strip by Israel that preceded the election. So for months on end, Israel unilaterally shuts all of the commercial crossings that it controls. Nothing is allowed in or out of Gaza for months. It completely devastates the economy. People are rightly upset. Farmers lose millions of dollars. At that time, it was the height of strawberry season and other produce that were ordinarily, with coordination, allowed to be exported out to the West Bank and Europe. On the heels of this, the Palestinian elections in 2006 happened, seeing the newly formed Hamas's political wing come to power. This was not anticipated, though their participation was encouraged, in the thinking being that it would kind of, you know, bring them into the broader political spectrum. The win was not anticipated, and it leads to, you know, the U.S. getting involved and the CIA doing what it does best, of course, meddling, and it funds an attempted coup. And you can read more about this in Vanity Fair, but they siphon in millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of arms to an opposing strong man known as Mohammed Dahalan to attempt to overthrow or even preempt. They hadn't really taken power yet. It doesn't work. Hamas counter coups. They take control of Gaza in 2007, and more sanctions and a full-fledged blockade is then slapped on in addition to the closure that already existed. Okay, that's kind of leading me up to the end of the presentation. Most of us are familiar with the blockade on Gaza that has existed since that time. I was trying to point out to you that kind of what preceded that. in terms of the political events that happened and also the closure that was already in place of Gaza. The blockade tightens even further with the stated goals of depriving Gaza of its basic freedoms, of fragmenting the Palestinians further, separating them from their counterparts in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And the stated tenets of the blockade by Israeli officials were no development, no prosperity, but no humanitarian crisis. And what they meant by that was, let us keep Gaza on the brink of collapse continuously, letting in only an intravenous drip of relief, but never letting it get to the point where it is an all-out catastrophe, which of course we are witnessing today. But this is back in 2008. Israel tells the US, keep Gaza on the brink of collapse, but don't push it over the edge. Keep it functioning at the lowest level possible. And that's exactly what happened. And asked about the goals of the blockade, Dov Weisglass, again, the guy who was the architect of the disengagement, said to Haaretz, the main Israeli newspaper at the time, the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. And we see this sort of weaponization of food happening yet again in a more brazen fashion now during the current crisis, but it's nothing new is my point. This has always been used as a tactic to be able to control Palestinians. What does effectively a blockade on Gaza mean? You're likely to be unemployed, be unable to rebuild a home that has been demolished or destroyed because of the ban on the entry of dual-use items, what are known as dual-use items like cement and so forth. You're unlikely to be able to visit family outside of Gaza. I always remind people that 75% of the population is under the age of 25. Half are under the age of 18. And almost all have never been outside of Gaza. In fact, I was speaking to a friend of mine. Some of you might know him. He's a Palestinian poet called Musab Abu Toha. And his young son is an American citizen. On his way trying to get out of Gaza a few weeks ago, he was stopped by Israeli soldiers that had set up a checkpoint within Gaza. And he was abducted and stripped and beaten and tortured. And finally, after a lot of pressure from the New Yorker that he wrote for, was released without any of his things or passport or belongings. But he later in a conversation told me, Leila, this was the first time in all of my years that I had ever seen an Israeli. And this was my first encounter. So what I'm trying to point out here is the only interaction, the only medium through which most Palestinians in Gaza have ever interacted with an Israeli is through the mediums of drones, of bombs, of snipers, and sometimes a remote voice, perhaps at a checkpoint. That's it. So that's bringing us to the current day. This is, I think, a few days old. The numbers, I think, are closer to 30,000 that have been killed right now. I'm not going to dwell too much on the numbers, but they should shock us all to our core. It is the most devastating war, in the words of the United Nations Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs representative, in all of her years working in the humanitarian sector, she has never seen an aggression this devastating in such a short time, such a short scale on a civilian population. And again, this is being funded with our tax dollars. Going back to my earlier point about the age of children in Gaza, many of them now mark their age with the number of assaults that they have survived. I was asked to touch on media a little bit, so I added these slides quickly. Again, I don't have much time to talk about this, but often what we see is the use of the passive voice when it comes to covering Palestinians in the media versus Israelis. So we often, and every day I face this issue when I'm speaking to editors or I'm trying to help someone work on an op-ed or something. This insistence, this immediate, questioning of a Palestinian death, first of all, and using the passive voice. So a Palestinian died rather than was killed or Israel killed a Palestinian. And if you insist on using that phrase, they'll usually put in there Palestinians say. So, I had a friend whose, brother was killed, and I think the headline said, so-and-so's, brother was killed, he says, or, reportedly, like it's never a fact that it happened. And of course, this has a real impact in terms of, the way that Palestinians are viewed. In the early 1980s, Edward Said published a seminal essay called Permission to Narrate that I encourage all of you to read. This was in regards to Israel's slaughter at that time of Palestinians in Lebanon and the ability to narrate our own stories in the media And I've just been thinking a lot about that recently, but he talks about how often the right to narrate war from Israel's perspective and according to Israel's interests, is what dominates. And not much has changed, unfortunately. Usually I tell people who are asking me, what do we do about this, to push back, to avoid the passive voice, to own the narrative. It does work when you talk to the media and you insist and you write a letter to the editor. It does work. This is an example of one of my friends who was writing an op-ed about the death of his brother and his brother's family. And they kept saying, I think this was the Washington Post, they had said, instead of Israel killed, might we say, an explosion, or he was saying, the editor was saying, and he said, no, they said, can we just say an explosion killed my loved ones rather than Israel killed my loved ones? And he immediately shot back and said, absolutely not, there isn't some random explosion that killed them. This was, and so it's just an example of how this works, how you have to understand the nuances of this language, and why words matter, because this dehumanizing language is used often to give Israel this moral pretext to slaughter Palestinians and desensitize the population to their slaughter. So it's not a big deal. And this is just an example over the years of different things Israeli leaders have said in regards to Palestinians, not just in Gaza, of course, but more broadly. Just another example of the language of genocide that Israeli leaders have been using. This was, of course, in the very early days of the war in Gaza, talk about fighting human animals, and later the Israeli prime minister framing this as a struggle between light and dark. Just kind of skip through some of this, but just some more examples of how, words matter and how disinformation is deadly for Palestinians and has a very real impact, not just on Palestinians there. This kind of language, again, supposedly gives Israel this moral pretext that it needs, but it therefore renders Palestinians less human or subhuman and dispensable or disposable, and has a real impact as well on Palestinian and Arab American communities and communities of color in the United States who are by association. And we saw this happen several times during the course of the past 3 months. By association, considered barbaric and subhuman and somehow responsible, right? These are just some of my family members on my mother's side that were killed several weeks ago. And this is my aunt in Gaza City who was killed in an Israeli bombed the house immediately next to her, and it killed her and my 3 adult cousins and my cousin's wife. I'm very moved by this. She was a novelist and poet, and this was the very last thing that she wrote. Of course, there's multiple examples, including my dear friend, Rifat al-Araghi, who many of you might know, who was killed, was told he was going to be killed by Israeli intelligence and then was targeted. His house was targeted. In his words, the most dangerous thing that he held in his hand was an expo marker. So we see the deliberate targeting of Palestinian intellectuals, of Palestinian institutions, of universities, of cultural institutions, of places of worship, which is why we talk about this as a genocide and as a war that is intended to make Gaza unlivable. I usually like to end with a little bit of inspiration. People often ask me how Palestinians cope, what they do. I often point, this is to past examples after the last war on Gaza, of a friend of mine that was an industrial engineer who had a 3D printing workshop, and they would print tourniquets and masks for burn victims. By the way, all of their printers were handmade from recycled materials and recycled filament, because I don't know how many of you know about this, but my son was really into this. So I was really fascinated by this. And none of these things were allowed into Gaza, so they made them themselves. The workshop was destroyed for the second time. A few weeks ago, I finally got in touch with him, and he himself was alive, but displaced twice, and everything that he owned and knew has been destroyed. So this deliberate targeting of Gaza's, again, its productive sector. This is an engineer, friend of mine, who had created this composite building material to help Palestinians rebuild their homes after the last war in Gaza. And then again, just ending with people often feel hopeless and completely demoralized. And I always end with this picture of this farmer that I met in Gaza who was replanting his farm for the 3rd time. And he was smiling and explaining to me how Israeli bulldozers had completely destroyed all of his farm for the 3rd time consecutively. And remember, olive trees take, you know, more than 10 years to become fruitful and productive. And yet here he was insisting and saying, this is my way of resisting. And I have no choice but to do this, but to keep going. And so I always remind people, if he can do that, and if Palestinians can do that, then we don't have an option at all. And I always tell people when they say, what can we do, is that no action is too small. Think about what you're good at, what your area of strength is, you know, what your community is, and do it. Just, you know, don't be a silent observer. Contribute in whatever way you know how. Maybe that's, you know, educate yourselves, educate others. Maybe that's a conversation you have with your neighbor or your community center. Maybe it's you know, just again, posting if you're on social media. Maybe it's going on a trip when the situation allows for it. Maybe it's lobbying, you know, your Congress members. Maybe it's phone banking. I don't want to take too much time up. I guess I took like way more than I was supposed to. Sorry about that.
No,
So
okay. I learned a lot from it. I hope everybody else learned a lot from it. Before we transition to the panel, it looks like we have maybe two.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to do the questions now or later. It's up to you.
Yeah, if we keep it quick, we can do them now real quick.
Let's cut it off like strictly 2 minutes. I'll keep the time at 8:21. We'll just cut it off, start the.
Thank you.
This is a simple yes or no question.
No, I'm just kidding.
Do you believe, or how do you feel about Israel's right to exist?
Well, I mean, I think most Palestinians say, you know, we have no issue at all, zero. I'm going to even take it a step further, at all with the Jewish people's right to exist. What we have an issue with is Israel existing as a racist state at the expense of Palestinians, if that makes sense. So Israel existing as an ethno-majority state exclusively for the Jewish people without Palestinians being given any rights or freedoms. That's what Palestinians have an issue with. But for time immemorial, Palestinians have had no issue at all, you know, living side by side peacefully with their Christian and their Jewish neighbors. And this has been the history of the land. And I imagine Sammy is going to be addressing that a lot more. Maybe you're not.
Well,
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure all the panelists would have a good answer to that
Yeah.
question, by the way. So let's hold the questions till the end, but thank you. But yeah, so thank you for that presentation, for giving that very, very important context and history there, Layla. And so without any further ado, you know, I think people have a good understanding of your background now, but if we could hear from our other panelists, you know, a little bit of, you know, background information about yourself and like what your connection to the issue is. But we start with Hannah Percy from Baltimore Jewish Voices for Peace.
Hi, y'all. I'm Hannah Persley. I am from Baltimore Jewish Voice for Peace. I am a social worker by profession. I specialize and work with forced migrants. So the Palestinian refugee issue is very personal to me professionally, and also as a Jewish person and as a human rights advocate. So thank you, Layla, for that amazing, concise introduction, and I'm
glad you thought it was concise.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And yeah, thank you, Sammy, for being here as well, and grateful to learn with all of you today.
Could you give some background information on Jewish Voice for Peace's organization?
That would be helpful. So Jewish Voice for Peace is a national organization. We have chapters across the U.S., and we are a group of anti-Zionist Jewish and our allies organizing towards collective liberation. And if anyone has questions afterwards, I'm happy to speak. The whole thing? So,
No.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes, but thank you.
Yeah.
Sam.
Cool. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be unto you all. My name is Sami Zaharna. I am a Palestinian American. I am also, like Layla, I am also from Gaza. My parents are from Gaza. I used to spend my summers there as a child. I currently serve as an imam, a religious leader here in Colombia at the Muslim Family Center. I live in Colombia. I have 4 children. My oldest is 12 now, 18 years. Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, obviously, the connection, my angle here is that this is very personal to me. My family is still there. as with Layla, we've lost many family members that were killed. Some, you know, I like the gamut, and I think that one of the things that you speak to people from Gaza, you see like the gamut of incredible, crazy stories as it pertains to what's happening in the war. So I've had my cousin, I have family members that were killed. I've had an aunt, my maternal aunt, and my paternal uncle, who both died, but they didn't just die randomly. They died because of a lack of medication. One was diabetic, one had a stroke, and there's no hospitals to go to. I had a cousin yesterday that even though they had permission to leave Gaza, she's 7 months pregnant. She can only give birth through C-sections. And so through a family member in Ireland, they got her permission, sent to the Egyptian border. But there's a war economy, there's warmongering that's happening now as a result of this. And she shows up at the border, and you know, the generals at the border want upwards of $30,000 per person. And anyone who's in Gaza knows this, like this is a thing. I have a cousin who just bought a tent for $1,200. And these are tents that were brought in through the Egyptian Red Crescent. And I have an uncle, listen to this, this is a crazy story. You know, we announced, Lena might remember this, we announced that I had an uncle that we heard the news that he was killed in an airstrike. He was in the Shifat hospital, el-Ahli hospital, the one that was bombed, if you remember, with a claim of mass tunnels. That of course is not true and was debunked many times over. So he went to a UNRWA school, a United Nations Relief and Works Agency school, that was bombed. He's blind. He went to another school and he was taking shelter there. Then we heard the news that he was killed. And so we spread the news on Facebook, we had condolences. And then 3 days later, we find out he's not killed. And so now my mother is older and this is her brother, her only brother. And so, you know, this roller coaster of emotions. So we just like, what happened? So what ends up happening is that his wife was severely injured. And the protocol there is that they take all the dead people and injured people to the nearest hospital where they do a tally. And he realized that the only way for him to stay with his wife, who's really his caretaker and who's injured and wants to be with her, is to act dead. So he acts dead. They throw him in the truck. And along with all those that died, and then he gets there, and then his sister-in-law saw him in the truck with the dead people, and they said, okay, he died. And so we found out he's not dead. Yeah. Anyway, so thank you everyone for being here, and yeah, look forward to having this conversation.
Well, thank you all for those introductions and for that background. And so, you know, Layla did a very good job of, you know, setting up the context and the history sort of before October 7th, but now, you know, and any one of you can take this on. And you touched on it a little bit in the PowerPoint. I understand not wanting to go too into detail because it's incredibly morbid, but, you know, could, you know, maybe somebody, you know, summarize what has happened since October 7th? What has Israel's reaction been? And then in response to that, what has the global reaction been to, you know, Israel's response? Whoever wants to take that.
You can talk.
This is your field today, though. So
Really, yeah, you know more than
I'm deferring to you most of these questions.
No, go. I mean, someone else talk. I can always add. Please, if you want to.
Go for it.
Maybe it's a good time for some questions before we get all of them out of context.
So 8:40, we're gonna start with audience questions. We're gonna have a panel discussion first, and then we'll
Go ahead.
for
How about you?
audience
You
questions.
take
So,
it.
yeah.
What has Israel been doing since October 7th?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have to cover all that. You could say some, and if the other people want to speak on it, but yeah.
I mean, the numbers are growing every day. Almost 30,000 people have been killed. About 2/3 of them are women and children. People are starving. Disease is setting in. Israel is talking about forced transfer into Sinai. The Israeli public generally seems to support these actions to the point that there have been raps and songs and famous artists singing about murder in Gaza. So it appears that the public sentiment in Israel is supportive of this. Layla, Sami, do you want to add anything? It's hard to.
So that's what Israel has done, and what is the global response to that been? At the
I mean,
United
it
Nations?
depends what, yeah. I mean, it's been this sort of systematic and deliberate, I'm still referring to the first question, destruction of everything in Gaza. And again, these were the stated goals. In the words of the Israeli military spokesperson Hagari, the objective is destruction, not accuracy. And in line with that, we have seen that over 75% of the fatalities have been women and children, that the overwhelming majority of residences in Gaza have been destroyed. And again, this is what they promised to do. Netanyahu said the objective is to make Gaza unlivable, with the understanding that things would get so bad that Palestinians, if were the border to become open or porous, would have no choice but to leave, and they would again thin out the population, otherwise known as population transfer to Sinai. And so that's what's been happening, just the targeting not only of civilians, but of civilian infrastructure. Firstly and foremost, they hit the beating heart of all of the Gaza Strip in Gaza City, in the Rimal neighborhood, and then they went to the institutions and then the universities, the water and the sewage, the places of worship, the farmland, 40% of it has been destroyed, all of the functioning wheat mills and bakeries.
Please. The Elkridge branch will close in 30 minutes at 9 p.m. If you need to arrange for a ride home, now is the time to do so. And
again, Gilad started by saying that they would, in conjunction with this, ban or prevent or restrict the entry of food and water and fuel and electricity. So that's in short what has been happening. And it has been defined as a genocide against Gaza and its people. And it's more children have been killed in just these 3 months alone than in 12 years of US war in Afghanistan. So it's mind-boggling in just, I think, the first 6 weeks, as a matter of fact. Yeah, but in terms of the global reaction, do you mean by like governments or by our government?
You can touch on both, because I think our response has been a little bit different than the global reaction.
I mean, I think it's resulted in a global outcry, at least on part of people. Governments, unsurprisingly, have been much slower to respond, especially our government, who has been complicit in this, who has been providing, financial, military, and diplomatic cover for the Israeli government, not to mention weapons. It's unconscionable and I want to say unprecedented on this scale, on this level. Certainly not unprecedented in terms of the way that the US has been giving unlimited funds and weapons to Israel in the past, but never on this scale before. And it has resulted in, global calls for a immediate and permanent ceasefire. Because the stated goals, none of the stated goals, at least as far as Israel is concerned, have been accomplished. But other things certainly have, the decimation of the people and the population in place.
And that is why you and many others, would consider this to be a genocide, because that basically is the definition of genocide, right?
Right. Well, I mean, the most difficult thing with genocide is intent, is proving intent. And this is what I'm not a legal scholar, but this is what legal scholars will say. That has been proven for us through the language and the words of Israeli leaders themselves.
Yeah. Did either of you want to add anything else? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess my another question I have is like, I and I think most international human rights organizations also agree that what's happening is a genocide. And so my question is like, why now, but also historically, why has the US been so willing to keep funding this despite how bad it sort of makes us look on the global scale? Like what is in it? What is in this for the US to keep justifying this stuff?
I mean, so my angle, I'm an imam, I'm a religious person. So morality and ethics is something I think a lot about. And what I will say, just speaking purely from, this is more philosophy, right? But from a moral philosophical perspective, is that there's this idea of utilitarianism, right? This idea that like, it's essentially a doctrine of what is good is what is beneficial. And I think for some reason, the calculus has been that there is some sort of benefit of supporting policies that morally, I mean, I would make the argument, and as many others ethically are problematic. Like there is a problem from just from a pure ethical perspective. And so the question is on us is like, can we support that, right? But what is the benefit calculus? I don't know. Maybe this is someone else's specialty to speak to.
I think law student can.
Law student, yeah. No, I haven't had that unit yet. But
Like, is your question, why is the Biden administration?
Yeah, the
like,
Biden administration and the administration, because Biden's foreign policy take isn't exactly a shift from like previous administrations on this issue.
I mean, I would argue it is actually, because he's,
How comes you mentioned the history from 1948 until the present, but how you decided to elect a terrorist group?
But she mentioned that prior to the election of Hamas, blockades and other forms of oppression were still being imposed on Gaza.
So there were bombs locked from that side onto the Jews. The goal for Hamas is to destroy the state of Israel and Jews. Period. That is their goal. And you talk about genocide, but there's a difference between Jewish society.
One fact that I didn't know, it was a kind of nice presentation, except for the things you skipped. You mentioned, to my surprise, that Gaza was established in 1948. I'm surprised by that because in 1948 there was a partition and the Palestinians and Arab neighbors chose not to set up a state.
Yes. Yes.
So
yes.
How can you complain about colonialism and apartheid when you choose not to live side by side? I also heard a lot about Israel. The Israelis think it's only for Jewish people. There is a difference between how Gaza Arabs are treated and West Bank Palestinian people are treated, and Israeli Arab population is treated. It is 20% of the Israeli population. They go to the best of schools. They are often presented in some of the best professions, such as medical professionals. And since October 7, they have dramatically increased the number of Arab Israelis that are supporting the state in behalf of what is going on in Gaza. It is now up to 70%.
I'm sorry, is there a question or is this a commentary?
I have question and comments because
we limited it to 1 minute, and I think you've been at a minute, and we're actually not at the audience Q&A part.
I mentioned very much that after 2006 there were no further elections, neither in West Bank nor in Gaza. What kind of society is that running without any elections in this whole?
So actually, I'm going to read you something. This is from the Israeli charter of the sitting government, the Likud government. Yeah. This is from the charter of the Likud party, the sitting Israeli government right now. The Jordan River will be the permanent eastern border of the state of Israel. Jerusalem is the eternal, undivided capital. The government will flatly reject Palestinian proposals to divide Jerusalem. The Israeli government flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state. So for all the talk we hear about Hamas rejecting Israel,
Hold on.
hang on, I'm
Stop,
talking.
stop, stop.
Wait.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Yes. There will be an audience, input section. We haven't got there. So I have another question before we get to the audience section.
And maybe we need to have like a talking stick because I
Yeah,
understand that we're adults, but also we're having trouble giving each other the chance to speak.
Yeah.
So we'll wait for one person to finish speaking.
Yeah.
We do have a, timer to make sure everyone can speak. Then we'll take turns responding to each other.
I just want to say something here before we actually, I didn't come here to get in an argument with Zionists. It is incredibly difficult and painful for us to sit here and use energy and compartmentalize for a second to come and teach you all about what is happening, about the genociding of our people. My aunt and my cousins were killed. I'm sorry, sir, just 1 second.
Sir,
I'm sorry.
please don't interrupt. Please don't interrupt, sir. All right.
I do not condone violence in any fashion or form, but please be respectful of our time and our presence here. We are speaking as our family members are being actively genocided with all of our tax dollars. When they send me pictures of unexploded bombs that say made in Pennsylvania, made in the United States, thank you very much, and signed by our government officials, let's just let that sink in for a moment. When more children are being killed than any other conflict in recent history.
We didn't invite you to interrupt you, Ben. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. So, thank you, Lisa. Bye. Bye, Lisa. Bye. Bye. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
I'd
you.
just like to remind us, we are all adults and we are in a library. There are like a few children
Yes.
here.
I'm
I
sorry.
understand there's a lot of emotions going on. If
For
there are
my,
questions,
if I can.
I would love for you guys to have us, if any of these questions are about the process of us being able to converse back and forth, that's what we're gonna get from you right now. If not, we're gonna have the panelists continue what they were saying. Then we can have audience questions about the subject matter. So if these are questions about how this is gonna work, absolutely. If not, we will wait. You go ahead.
I have just want to clarify one issue that someone brought it up here.
Is it about the subject matter or is it about?
Subject.
Okay, we're gonna wait on that. So if you can hold that in
I
your
think
brain
all
for a
these
second.
questions are subject matter.
Okay, if anything
So,
is about how we're sharing turns, that's what we're asking right now. Otherwise, we're gonna have the panelists continue saying what they were gonna say, and then we'll have audience questions. Okay. So subject matter, keep it in your brain. Love to hear it. Want to hear it. Amazing. Just we're gonna come back to you.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Anyone else have a question about how this is gonna operate?
I think we're good on this.
Okay.
I just want to say that we, as people who are trying to learn, then not to take personal every comment, please, because we also are here, we're acknowledging that there are adults, kids, mothers, fathers, that we are human beings, bottom line, and we're trying to understand each other and to just show empathy. That's what I want us to just have. It's not an easy conversation, and when people take so personal, it's just not room for discussion and being open and to just be just more, open-minded in general.
Thank you.
And for any Zionist Jewish folks that are still in the room, thank you for being here to still learn with us. And I challenge you to hold space for both our pain and the great pain that Palestinians are facing right now. There's room for both.
Yes.
So please, I challenge.
Thank you for that.
We'll get back to it. We'll get back to it though. This is still this part. So I have a question before we go to audience questions, because this man's had his hand up for a long time. We're gonna get to it in a second, but I have one last question, sort of based on like what just happened here, especially from Hannah, although Sammy or Layla want to touch on it as well, but like let's say somebody's question was, no, I don't think that there should be, a Jewish state or, a Muslim state or a Christian state for that matter. Is that an inherently anti-Semitic thing? Is criticism of the state of Israel or anti-Zionism, is that the same as anti-Semitism, or are they two completely, different?
So I see how people easily could conflate the two. Lots of Jewish people live in Israel. They call it a Jewish state. The Star of David is on the flag. It seems like a really easy conflation to make. But in fact, there are so many other powers, ill-intentioned powers that be involved in Israel. The largest organization that donates to Israel are evangelical Christians. And they donate lots of money to Israel because they are intent on triggering the rapture, whereby all Jews gather in the Holy Land. The end times begin, in which most Jews either perish or convert to Christianity. We also have Germany that donates millions of dollars to Israel to wipe its hands of the Holocaust. But donating money to the Israeli military certainly isn't helping Jewish communities around the world. And there are ample Jewish and Israeli anti-Zionists around the world. There are Israelis in Israel advocating against the atrocities going on against the Palestinian people today. So no, I don't think that being anti-Israel is the same as being anti-Semitic. It is a state, it is a military that is committing genocide. It is antithetical to any Jew who claims to live by the Torah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Hannah. And as promised, do want to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask whatever questions they may have. And so you've had your hand up. You've been patient.
A little bit of short time. I'm going to time everyone.
Yes.
So we can all have a chance to speak. I'm also going to do this because we're having trouble.
Thank you, ma'am.
If you do not have this, just don't chime in. I know you want to. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. You don't have to speak into it. Just this is
I have a comment. Yes.
Keep it to a minute, but yes.
About terrorism. They
May I
say
have your attention, please? The Elfrid branch will close in 15 minutes at 9 p.m. All copiers and computers will automatically shut down 5 minutes before closing. So please be sure you have saved your work. The DIY Center and the exit near the DIY Center will also close 5 minutes before the hour. Thank you.
Hamas has been called as a terrorist. Who defines this terrorism? Who has it? America and Western Europe have defined terrorism. Mandela and the people in South Africa who were standing for their rights were called terrorists. Mandela, after he was president, he was still considered a terrorist until at the time of Bush, and they changed his label from terrorism to someone who's the president of the country. So this issue, who defines it as terrorists? They are not terrorists. They're fighting for their land, occupied land. Since 1967, the United Nations has had so many resolutions. General Assembly had resolutions condemning Israel and saying that it must give back those occupied territories, and they refuse to give them back. So, this is the issue, and they say that they're terrorists.
Wait a minute, I have to cut you off.
Yeah, no, point taken. Is a very easily weaponizable term, and one person's freedom fighter is not supposed to.
So after the genocide that's happening and the destruction of all your homes and your family's homes there, these rules are still in place. So there's no reconstruction that's going to happen after that, is what I'm hearing. Essentially, so that you can't bring in building materials, you can't bring in anything to rebuild your home. So everything that they're destroying now is to ensure that you can't stay there.
So in the immediate, in the here and now, there's no building materials being allowed in and nothing. Ordinarily what happens, because this isn't the first assault, it's just the biggest and most sort of atrocious. Building materials that are allowed in are very, minimal, a trickle. And so it's sort of an excruciatingly slow process to rebuild. You saw the slide I had of the kind of inventive ways Palestinians were using to rebuild. So it's not that they don't eventually rebuild, but it just takes forever. And it's of course, the scale that we're talking about now is very different than the scale that we were talking about before. So even if Israel is now saying, oh, okay, soon we're ending this phase of the war and we'll allow Palestinians back to the north, like to what, most of the
speak up to get them materials that you need to read.
Yeah, a lot of people have been trying to go back. Many of them have been shot on their way back, but often they'll just sit in the rubble of their homes just to be able to stake their claim and say, this area, this is my land, and I'm just going to stay here until I can rebuild it. Or they'll just put tents up or something like that.
I'd just like to clarify that one question came out that, why I think the Rich left, why they do deal with the terrorist organizations. If you look at that history, that when Condoleezza Rice was the Secretary of State, she's the one advocated that Gaza, that election should go on. And Hamas was part of the election process. It was totally endorsed by Bush administration that Hamas election was going on. And then if you look at in 2016, when WikiLeaks was coming up, Julian Assange that leaked that WikiLeaks. It was claiming that the US was advocating that Hamas be elected so that they can divide and conquer with Mahmoud Abbas. Let's leave that, and that WikiLeaks was pretty much open. So it was kind of like they wanted Hamas to be the leader. Then later on, they can weaponize and they can divide Mahmoud Abbas without context.
Do you mind if I comment on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think it's Edward Said. I know Leila mentioned Edward Said. He was a member of the PLO at some point, which was a designated terrorist organization. Except for some reason, we made exceptions for American members of it.
That's true. I never thought about that.
It makes no sense, but I think it proves the point. But anyway, he was a professor at Columbia, some of you may know, the late Edward Said, and he was once at in some sort of debate, and they started it off, and the other guy was just, you can find this on YouTube. The other guy was just screaming at him, "I don't negotiate with terrorists. I speak out against a PLO. Speak out against a PLO." It's very similar to Hamas type of language, right? And he said something that really resonates with me. And I think we should, it, to me, is always a response to, well, Hamas is doing this. And it's very simple, right? What he said, listen, I will never, as a person of peace, I will never condone, I will never encourage, right? I will never condone the killing of innocent civilians, no matter where they are. As a person, as a Muslim, that's against my faith, same response. But he said, but I will never seize the right of an oppressed, occupied people to resist, right? And I will never place a spotlight on the person that's stuck in their basement and is trying to get out, right? So all this nonsense about Hamas, Leila, I think very clearly demonstrated that this issue existed before Hamas. I encourage you all to read Khandi's book, Rashid Khandi's 100-Year War on Palestine, right? That shows that this is a continuation of continued oppression, ethnic cleansing, and killing, whether you like the words or not, I really don't care. But this is the reality of what's happening today. And if you want to turn a blind eye to it, so be it. Anyway.
Thank you. Back here. It's just a I know there's no batteries in it.
Just for show.
I wanted to say that I'm doing research on suicide prevention at Johns Hopkins.
If the mic doesn't work.
Yeah, sorry, there's no batteries.
It's just for show.
Closer, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
Hello, peace be upon you all. I wanted to come in and just offer a little bit of perspective. We're all in our head space right now, not in our heart space. I do suicide prevention research. I'm a grad student at Hopkins. And I just want us to put something in perspective. Violence, structural violence only works in one direction. Okay, it only works in one direction. It doesn't work back and forth. And you can see that result in how people kill themselves. Who's killing themselves as a result of what they're going through? Those are deaths that don't make the news. That's a perspective that doesn't make the news. And Dr. Rafat El-Haddad, the one that Layla you mentioned, you know, one the expo marker and his famous last poem, he even suggested himself, like, what are we supposed to do? Commit mass suicide? And when the indigenous people in this country were being colonized, the Arawak Indians used cassava root to poison themselves in mass because of colonization. And that is a very striking parallel to what's going on in Palestine right now. And so I just wanted to offer that perspective from a heart space, because we should be thinking about those people and praying for all of that.
Thank
you.
But you see,
Hold on. We got other people. Come on, we got other people. Talking sick.
She never answered the question. She never answered the question.
We got time at the end.
She never answered the question. Why are you afraid of it? What? She never answered the question. Come on, let's just tell her to answer the question.
Peace be upon you all. So one of the slides seemed to encourage visiting Palestine, traveling to Palestine. Obviously, it's occupied territory. So, you know, to what extent is it ethical or moral for non-Palestinians or for those who don't have family in that area to go there, since you know it's unavoidable? It's inevitable. At 9 p.m. The apartheid system will need to bring this up now. All study rooms will need to be we will be closing the building in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. We will be open tomorrow at 10 a.m. Traveling there, or if you want to visit, you know, the Dome of the Rock or the Masjid al-Aqsa, or should we wait until inshallah it's all liberated?
I'll answer this one. I think you're touching on the fatwa that doesn't allow it. So let's touch base after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was asking from an non-Islamic, just like a human perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I actively encourage everyone who is able to go and see for themselves. And now the way through which you do that matters. So I would usually encourage people to go through the land crossings, for example, through Jordan and through the Jordanian-Israeli border crossings. That's the way that I recommend, not through the airport. Go through, you know, if you're stay in the occupied territories, or in East Jerusalem, for example, support, you know, Palestinian establishments, but see for yourself and don't just, you know, go as a cushy tourist. That's when it becomes problematic. And I guess the same applies anywhere that you travel, right? But go with the intention of wanting to learn and understand. And I mean, I always tell people, go and visit, see for yourselves. Your mind will be boggled literally by what you see. It doesn't really take much. And there's a lot of really, you know, great programs that facilitate this. So,
yes.
We do have to start cleaning up.
Okay.
The library closes at 9. You're welcome to, you know, kind of make your way out. You can speak to each other, obviously.
Yes.
Feel free to continue to talk about this important topic. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists who should not have to do this, but thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your energy and your time.
Thank you all for coming. Please continue to stay involved. It's going to be a big fight to put the pressure on our legislators that we need to take action. We're going to need a lot of organized people. So thank you all for coming. So,
and we'll just